AskReddit by raw asparagus. People who knew someone who died in a freak accident. What happened? I used to work for a septic company. A guy who drove one of the big septic trucks that sucked out underground septic tanks at people's houses had to get on his hands and knees and reach into the tank because the lid had fallen in. He lost his balance and fell headfirst in. His shoulders got wedged in the opening and he drowned upside down in human waste. I don't think I've ever heard of a worse way to go. The homeowner found him after about an hour. I live near the Mississippi River. A few years ago some workmen were doing something near the river involving the sewer lines in some caves near the river. They ended up drowning in sewage. I agree, a slow nasty death for sure. A family friend bumped his head, walked about 15 feet across his backyard, sat at his picnic table and died. Autopsy showed no head trauma, but he broke his neck when he hit his head. They figured the walk across the yard caused something to shift enough to do fatal damage to his spinal cord. My sister came so close to dying in a somewhat similar way. She was in a car accident and was pulled out of the wreckage by some friends. She was guided to some grass by the side of the road to sit and wait for the ambulance. She apparently kept saying her neck was really sore and damp, was asking people to help her pop it. Thankfully, her friends were smart enough to encourage her to leave it alone. She gets to the hospital and amp, some yahoo either doesn't read the x-ray or reads it wrong and amp, agrees that her neck is just sprained or something and amp, wants to send her home. Somehow, someway, they ended up transferring her to another hospital before that happened who discovered her badly broken neck which required surgery to fix and left her with permanent nerve damage. I have no idea how she didn't end up paralyzed or dead. She has the stupidest luck where the most random bad things will happen to her but. This happened a long time ago but a neighbor was trying to weld a gas tank and didn't realize that he should have filled it with water beforehand. The tank exploded and killed him. Former co-worker of mine was gored by a bison while on a trail run. Ironically, he often posted on message boards for the park to be aware of wild animals while there, and in one post he said there are too many people with headphones on, or trying to get too close to the bison to take selfies. He was normally very careful apparently. When I was a kid, probably 12 or 13, we were visiting a family friend. I grew up in a small town in the 90s so my mom was never one to worry about supervision. Their neighboring farm had a kid my age who dared me to go touch a bison in their field. I got close and it started charging me. I managed to make it back over the fence just in time. I can think of many different ways I almost died as a kid and my mom is horrified to hear the stories I tell now as a 30-year-old adult lol. A guy I knew was setting up a rope swing over a lake for his kids and their friends, which he had done many times before. He always would take a practice swing himself before he would let the kids go. His hand slipped off the rope and he fell before he was over the lake. He hit his head on a rock and died in front of the kids. In high school I came home from a night out telling my dad how we were out at a quarry with a rope swing. My dad knew exactly where I was talking about and absolutely lost his shit on me. My dad never yelled at me, but a friend of his lost his teenage son. He drowned in that quarry. When I was a 13-year-old boy, I witnessed my grandfather die. He was less than 15 feet away from me when he was decapitated by shrapnel from a broken piece of heavy farm equipment. I'm 50 years old and still struggle with that moment in time. PTSD can be a real bitch. Something similar happened a few years back to a couple of students in the school I work at. They were sitting in their grandpa's truck while grandpa was trying to move some farm equipment. Not quite decapitation but he got hit hard enough to kill him instantly. The kids were too young to go for help, like 4 and 5 or something like that, and they had to sit in that truck until their dad came looking for them. A friend of a friend showed up at his girlfriend's apartment with a head wound. He didn't know how it happened. He also didn't know how he drove over there. She took him to the ER where he ended up passing away. He had his keys, wallet and phone on him. The only thing we could think of is he might have tripped, fell and hit his head in the wrong spot. It was probably muscle memory that got him there. How awful. I was snowboarding in 1997 in Switzerland with a good friend. He was skiing. I had caught an edge and landed on the back of my head while also twisting my knee badly. I was being looked over by the mountain rescue and first aid. I told my friend he could keep skiing. I would head back to our villa. I ended up going to sleep at around 6 PM as I had a hot shower and some Tylenol 3s after dinner. I woke up to see my friend hadn't returned and thought it was odd, but maybe he hooked up with a lady at some bar. Friend never came back from skiing. He was found deep in a crevasse the next afternoon and frozen to death. Shit, I once got stuck in a crevasse in Austria, Lech. I could hear people ski right above me and nobody would see me or hear me. It was early in the day, so I talked myself down from panic and reminded me that I had a good 8h of light, so I had to get to work. I slowly carved and crawled my way out of it. It was a frightening experience. My neighbor was cleaning his gutters and fell off his roof because he missed his footing when stepping. Fell right on his head. This was a few years back now, but the family moved quickly after, even though it had been their house for like 30 years. I can't say I blame them. My father-in-law almost walked off the roof last summer when we were doing shingles. 2-story drop onto a truck tailgate. But he was a climber, so he hooked his heel while teetering off the edge and pivoted onto the roof. It was a miracle. A friend of my dad's was overseeing a repaired braided 3-stroke 4 cable being spooled from one drum to another, at very high speed and tension. He had his gloved hand loosely on the wire guiding it into position, a big no-no in the industry. A frayed wire came through, snagged his glove and dragged him into the drum, wrapping him into a contorted paste within seconds. These sucked into a machine deaths are some of the most freaky to me. A friend slipped and fell in the tub, cracked his head. His roommate found him a half hour later. Died on the way to the hospital. I've always been afraid of falling and dying in a bathroom. A girl I went to grade school with was crushed under a Smith machine at a local gym, 24-hour gym, so no one was around to help. The TV station I worked at previously had a gym in it, and during the midnight shift, the security guard, during his break, decided to lift some weights alone in the gym. He lifted the bar, which was apparently too heavy, and it came crashing down and cut off his circulation. No one discovered him until about 6 hours later when someone came in to use the shower in the gym. A friend of mine was riding his 4-wheeler out at an off-road park. He kicked up a tree branch that impaled him in the thigh. He bled to death before anyone even knew it happened. I knew a brother and sister who were riding 4-wheelers through the woods on the back of their property, and the sister was in the front. They were racing, and looked back to make a face at her brother and didn't see a branch about neck high. She did not make it and it fucked him up. A guy I went to high school with was helping his family do some repairs to a silo on their family farm. A section of the silo's roofing gave way and in he went. Suffocated under thousands of pounds of grain. My granddad lived on a farm and had a massive barn full of grain. As kids, 4 kids aged 4-9ish, we found our way in and went swimming in it. We didn't know why our parents looked so horrified when they found us. Girl I grew up with was driving home in college and go into a horrible car accident that gave her brain damage and pretty much removed her jaw from her skull. Tons of surgery, and 3 years later, she walked down the aisle at her wedding. She was in her yard a few months after her wedding and tripped, felt dizzy and fell, they aren't sure, and hit her head on pavement patio, and her husband found her dead. Holy shit, to go through all that and overcome it and then die a little while later is utterly tragic. Swimming, and one of my buddies was screwing with the great thing over a drain at the bottom. Got his foot stuck and couldn't extricate himself. His brother, cousin, and I nearly drowned trying to free him, so we got to watch him die. Haven't thought about this one in a bit. I saw a Dateline episode about this kind of thing in the late 90s and it's been a fear of mine ever since. My uncle was mowing grass on an embankment next to a small body of water. The mower unexpectedly slipped down the embankment and overturned on top of him, pinning him under the water. He drowned in a few feet of water that he otherwise could have stood up in. Edit. Lots of folks asking where when. Not recent. About 13 years ago in the American Southeast. Based on responses, though, maybe not as much of a freak accident as I thought. Seems to happen a lot. When my mom was working in hospitals, they had a patient whose tractor rolled over him and he fell into a ditch with water. He was so lucky because he was on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and when he rolled over, a car passed by. The woman driving rushed to his aid and held his head out of the water. This was before cell phones, so she had to wait holding him until another car drove by and then rushed to the nearest house to use the phone. Guy made a full recovery thanks to that woman being there at the exact right time. If you live in corn-heavy Midwest areas of America, you're probably familiar with detailing. Detailing is a job a lot of smaller towns will let kids do, I think from 13 up, with parental permission. It's very common where I'm from. Essentially, you just walk with a group of other people through cornfields pulling the tassel off the top to prevent them from germinating and seeding excessively. Anyway, like 2 years after I did it, there was an accident involving 2 high school freshmen stepping into a puddle that an electric irrigator was shorting into. One of them basically died immediately, the other en route. R.I.P. Hannah Rand. I grew up 20 minutes north of Freeport and remember this story. It happened the first year I was old enough to detail, but our parents wouldn't let us do it after that incident. We didn't have internet back then and were told they drowned. Had an uncle that lived down at the beach. Used to spend a lot of time out on a Bertram fishing boat. Many beers were usually enjoyed during those times. They used to go out into deeper water and jump off the flybridge, the roof part of the boat where there are controls as well as a place to sit. One day he went out with some friends and they decided to partake in said jumping. Unbeknownst to him, the tide had gone out and they had drifted into shallow water. He dove in head first, hit the bottom, killed him. An old buddy I had known since elementary school died while driving when a chunk of loose gravel was kicked up through his windshield by a passing truck on the freeway. His best friend had been riding in the passenger side and had to steer the car to safety. It was nobody's fault, just a complete freak accident. I've always felt terrible for the friend who had to watch it happen. I think about my friend who died a lot. He was a really cool guy. I still remember playing basketball with him during recess when we were kids. It's strange to think that he never could have known how his life would end or see it coming in any way. That kid I used to play basketball thought he still had an entire life ahead of him. You can die due to a fucking piece of gravel? Fuck. Life is unfair. A mom went ice skating. Little slip, fell. All everyone saw was her bumped her head lightly. Family finished skating. On the ride home, she started speaking gibberish. Dad dropped kids at the grandparents, took mom to the air. Brain swelling, coma, dead a week later. This happened to Liam Neeson's wife, only they were skiing. Fell and bumped her head, got checked out and assumed she was fine, and died later that day. Edit. Thanks for the commenters who clarified. Apparently she died 2 days later after initially refusing treatment. I remember the details wrong. Still very sad and unthinkable, though. Teacher in my school lost all 3 kids in a freak traffic accident on the highway. Their car lost a tire, which caused them to swerve into the gas tank of a semi-truck, which exploded, killing 2 of them instantly. The 3rd kid managed to crawl out of the car while he was on fire, and died later in the hospital. The saddest part is that they were all on their way to visit their father in the hospital after his back surgery. One night at a trauma center I worked in, we had 3 patients initially come in, a dad and 2 daughters. One was 6 and one was 3. The dad accidentally rolled his SUV over a highway off-ramp and landed roof down. All of them dead. We called time of death on the dad pretty quickly but worked both kids for quite a while. Both ended up dying. Turns out another daughter walked away with a broken arm and was found walking down the highway away from the crash. Awful night. There was a person at the beach who got impaled by a flying beach umbrella. Horrible situation. Her husband was right beside her and she died within seconds. Holy shit, after reading lots of these, this has to be the worst and not a death by misadventure alive 1 second, totally dead the next completely random. Chance occurrence. My Sil's aunt died of hypothermia. She went for a walk out in the hills in the winter. She knew the trail very well but got disoriented by a light snowfall and got lost. She got cold and tired, laid down by a rock and died of hypothermia. She was 100 yards from her car. A friend told me a story about her great-grandma disappearing in Massachusetts in the 1880s. They lived next to her great-aunt. There was 100 feet of woods with a very well-established path straight through. Think a strip of wood separating the properties, but in between homes that visit 2-3 times a day. Basically 10 or 12 folks with 2 houses to share, they live so closely. She says it was a wide, clear path of dirt. Grandma had dinner at Auntie's house and left to go home. Somewhere in those 100 clear feet, she completely vanished and was never seen again. No rivers, no caves, no wild animals to speak of. They can only assume she either had planned to up and leave in the way you could only do in the 1800s, or she was abducted completely silently and carried away. No remains ever found. Childhood friend of mine drowned. His leg got trapped swimming in a relatively shallow river. He went down and just never came back up. It happened to one of the nicest people I ever knew, and it makes me so mad that we lost touch before I found out what happened. I knew a girl that died the same way. Craziest part about it was that she was with her dad, who was a professional rafting guide. He immediately jumped out after her and tried to pull her out but couldn't. They actually had to dam up the river the next day to retrieve her body. Don't fuck with rivers. A guy I went to HS with got hit by a train. It wasn't suicide. It was before Uber and he had been at a party drinking. He did the responsible thing by taking the subway. When he heard the train coming, he stood up to